Hi, this is me, and this is another discussion. I'm gonna call it a discussion because I'm gonna answer some things that have come up. Um, at the end of my last video on this channel, I actually mentioned that um, a lot of the cost problems with education, or a lot of the problems with American education, aren't just because of cost. And in fact, there's not actually anymore a lot of direct correlation between the cost to educate and results. And I'm going to go into that in some detail today. So, one thing that you need to know when you deal with American education is despite what you think, the US on average actually spends more per student um, than most of the rest of the world. The global average spent amongst the OECD, um, so that's the Association of Economically Developed Countries, um, is actually about 10,000, $11,000 a year. And yes, it is that high. But the US actually spends on average 16 to $17,000 per student per year. Right? That's actually more expensive than most private schools. Well, not than a lot of private schools. All right. Now, you might ask yourself, okay, where's that going? And why is it so high? I heard that teachers get paid less, and actually, they do. So one of the interesting things about this is, for example, South Korea, which it actually spends less than 10,000 per year per student. Um, the teacher and the average teacher in South Korea actually earns 1.2 what the average 1.2 times what the average university graduate does. And so why is the cost so high in the United States? Well, there's a couple reasons. One of which is that education in the United States, even at the primary and secondary level, has actually had the same admin bloat problem as education at the post secondary level in universities, but that it's often hidden. The admin bloat isn't even in site principals, although there has been an increase in site administration. There's more vice principals than there used to be, more curriculum coordinators, more graduation coaches, etc. The real explosion has been at the board level in consultants, curriculum designers, pedagogical consultants, etc. And this really began to balloon during NCLB's height in the end of the Bush years. It's been something that's been happening since the late 1990s, though. But even that's not totally the sole cause. It's a lot of it, though, and we'll get into that in a second. But a lot of the administration, some of it's not necessary. Some of it's doing pedagogy. Some of it's justifying jobs that aren't really even totally all that efficacious. And we know they're not efficacious because we've actually seen declines in educational results as these positions have grown. But another issue is that a lot of it is actually legally mandated. Now, I know I'm going to sound like a libertarian here, but it's true. And it's not legally mandated even for things like standardized testing or inner city school compliance, although that's a lot of it. And I can tell you some personal anecdotes and stories that I could verify for you if you want. And I will in a few minutes. But a lot of it also has to do with the fact that a lot of the social services that other countries provide outside of school are provided in school and only in school in the United States. From the Panthers pushing the free school lunch program, which actually led to that, free and reduced lunch program across the country. Thank you, Black Panthers, for that, I guess. Um, there was this trend afterwards, like the trend of military Keynesianism. Well, we won't do direct Keynesian development, but we will do it through the military. Similarly, there was we won't do direct social spending even on children, but we'll do it through schools. School breakfast and lunch programs, after school programs. Um, we run clothing units. We run all kinds of social work through the schools themselves. And these require legal compliance administration so that we're not breaking laws. And that creates a lot of the personnel cost. 91% of the budget of the schools, which has, as I said, has doubled depending on the state in the last 2 decades, goes into personnel cost. It mostly goes into this administrative positions, which are often highly paid. And another thing goes into is consulting positions, which are often highly paid. During the height of the recession, this is when I quit teaching in the United States public school and went abroad. We were having to lay off something like I think something like 1 in 6 teachers needed to be laid off. So everyone who was younger than me and all the growth we'd recently done had to be laid off immediately. In the same time period, we also were hiring $100,000 a year consultants to come in, and that's 2, sometimes 3 at the time, teacher salaries, um, and advise us on how to make our pedagogy better while we were letting the pedagogues go. This has actually led to a weird gap in most states where you have a lot of very young teachers who have been in the field from less than 5 years, um, and even people who've established for less than 10, and then a lot of people who've been in 2025 who entered in the early 90s or late 80s. A lot of those people, however, are leaving because of COVID, and they're not coming back. They're just getting too old, and the rest of the workforce is deracinated. So you have this explosion in cost, but less of it going to teachers, less of it going to make the job more attractive. And no, it's not even going to equipment and stuff like that. That's often paid for by separate tax lines. And this leads to certain situations. Another thing that happened in Georgia was we had to open a school because we had a sales tax that paid for that school's opening. But since the personnel was on the property taxes, we couldn't pay to staff the school we had to open. I won't tell you where this is, but this definitely happened. Now, there are other absurdities in this, and I could go into them. A lot of free and reduced lunch and poverty program studies in the United States, notice I said free and reduced lunch and poverty together, are actually misleading. I'll tell you a story about a study that was done establishing a bunch of best practices off of a school with a 100% free and reduced lunch program. I thought it was suspicious. Actually, this was right before when I was beginning to do research for what I was planning on doing in my PhD when I was going to do one in education. And I researched this particular county and discovered that the county had a nuclear power plant in its district. And so all students had free and reduced lunch. However, the county was um, about 10K richer than the surrounding area, even though it was being used for poverty program design, because it was assumed that 100% free and reduced lunch equaled poverty without even checking to see the average income of the area. And stuff like that plagues educational research. There's all kinds of statistical bugaboos like that. And we often base pedagogical advice off of that, even when there's better research that indicates counter things. I'll give you an example. Believe it or not, the 2 most effective things for a student relationship is 1, you like the teacher, and 2, the teacher has consistent standard approaches. Those have high efficacy rates on what's called Hattie's efficacy effect scale, and that's just a meta study looking at all the various studies and combining them for effect ratios. Whereas most of the innovations in public school, charter school, and pedagogy have almost no efficacy. And both Hattie and Marzano, who's a separate researcher, have showed that while all these studies in teacher efficacy have been done, there have been no significant gains in overall educational achievement. There have been some closing of the educational gaps, although they started to drop off in 2017. And I imagine during COVID, from the stats I've seen, they've fallen off a cliff. Now, so it's not money that's causing the problem, it's the structure of how the money's being used. Now, let me tell you another thing about these educational stats. Often we talk about where the best education is. You will notice that even I was looking at a Guardian article, does not compare the United States to Great Britain and France, because Great Britain and France, while they have better educational systems and their standards are pretty rigorous, their outcomes are pretty close to the United States actually on PISA scores. Why? Well, they have the same economic and inequality problems that the US does. Also, high immigrant populations that are not very well integrated into the school system. and are not very well served by it. Now, I say all that to point out an issue here. If you looked at the top two PISA score, and PISA is the international test that we make these international comparisons with, countries, you'd have Finland and South Korea. Finland educates with a short teaching day. It has inquiry-based education where students drive a lot of their own study. South Korea while it does have very well-paid teachers, has a long education day where teaching is often privatized into the evening through cram schools such as Hagwons, because while you really can't fail an individual class, you can fail the mini exams that get you into the next level of schooling. And when you fail that, well, the suicide rate goes up. So you have a pedagogical model that is almost the exact opposite of Finland's. That's number one and number two in your high scoring PISA, meaning that the confounding factors is not pedagogy or the design of the school, it is probably social concerns. All the schools, all the countries that have more success than the United States, Canada, Finland, Germany, South Korea, Singapore, Hong Kong, all have relatively equal societies comparatively to the United States. And other countries that are just as developed, France, Britain, who are as unequal as the United States, have similar results. Now, I'm not saying that it's all social, but it's largely social. Now, good education on an individual level actually does mitigate for some of this, but a lot of that's your relationship to the teacher itself. There's no shortcut for that. There's no shortcut for good direct instruction, and there's no shortcut for someone making sure your basic needs are met. If those aren't taken care of, and in the United States, we disproportionately try to take care of it in school, where it causes a cost problem, well, what are you going to do? It would be cheaper to handle this other ways and let the schools focus on what the schools are designed to do, which is educate students. I mean, arguably that's what they're designed to do. They're designed for a lot of things, and some of them are more cynical than others. I mean, one of the things that you will notice is that the push to stop high school dropouts has not led to, say, an increase in literacy. In fact, literacy has declined as graduation rates have gone up in the last 5 years. We also seen a marked increase in college remediation courses, even for basic jobs, because a lot of people didn't get those skills with the degrees they earned in high school. Now, the push is to push more students out with a degree because the statistical damage of not having a degree is super high. But if those students are now going to, you know, community colleges to get just basic skills to do jobs on their own cost and taking small amounts of college debt without getting full degrees, which means that they won't get a massive benefit for that debt. Well, you can see how we're now charging kids for stuff they used to get for free while increasing the graduation rate. Now, not every state is equally guilty on this. Not every state. The U.S. is a highly federated system. For those outside of the U.S. who don't know this, so that there are huge differences. For example, um, the lowest paying districts for per student on their cost per student do not necessarily have the worst outcomes. I actually work in one of the students who historically, I'm one of the districts which historically does not pay as much per student. It's about 7K now. I think at one point it was as low as 5 recently. Um, but has intermediate level results. All right, mostly because it pulls for a pretty good educational demographic. So it tells you the problem isn't just money, but also it tells you that there are a bunch of compounding problems in this. And again, so my school may only spend 7,000 per student. The average teacher salary there is probably about 50K because a lot of people don't make it 5 years, and the starting salary is about 45, 46K. So you can see where these costs are. Other personnel costs include pensions, which a lot of people can't get anymore because of pension reforms in those states. And it's not true in the Northeast and some of the West Coast, which are very well off, but it's true other places. And another thing about the United States is overwhelmingly states pay for schools and local taxes, meaning richer schools will always be better funded, um, or at least have the ability to be better funded for a lower tax rate. You just have more revenue coming in. And all these problems continue. Now, what I find interesting in all our talk of education, I normally hear socialists talk about teachers' unions, maybe getting rid of charter schools, and charter schools are a massive money suck out of the education system. They're not shown to be markedly better or markedly worse than most high schools. They're just less regulated, but they are a way for private corporations to take a lot of money out of the system, particularly in places where they can be run for profit. I want to ask you, how do you run something for profit that doesn't have a market price, but is dependent on taxes? You exploit labor and you get everything as cheap as possible, and you take the money and you reinvest it. That's what you do. And you can see why this would encourage a lot of what we call moral hazard. Now, moral hazard is a neoliberal problem, concept of economics. I'm not, socialists don't normally talk about it, but ironically, a lot of the people who talk about the moral hazard of taxes will then go and encourage charter schools who have even more incentive to have said moral hazard, since they are effectively only can make a profit by running costs down and doing everything on the cheap. So much for charter schools, waiting for Superman, right? But outside of those issues and maybe better pay for teachers, I don't hear a lot of this discussed because a lot of people in socialists, even when they work in education, don't seem to know the structure of US education beyond their immediate job. And this is a problem of complexity that plagues a lot of the economy when we talk about this kind of stuff. And it's something you don't tend to know. Now, since I've been talking about politics this entire time on this channel, and I'm going to stop just doing that, I wanted you to think about the political implications of what I'm telling you. One, that even people in the job often can't advocate for what they need to advocate because it's beyond their position. So my teachers union doesn't deal with stuff like this. All right. Two, um, a lot of the public doesn't deal with the administrators, which are causing the bloat. And they also need the services provided by the government without realizing that the way it's been structured causes all kinds of unnecessary admin bloat. And we see in the United States the same problem in medicine, and we see the same problem in higher education. But in secondary education, it's hidden. And the only people a lot of people interface with are maybe site principals and teachers who they are mad at, even though they're underpaid and understaffed and etc. COVID has exacerbated all these problems in ways that I could get into. People who were previously touting the fact that e-education was going to make all this super cheap because you can increase class sizes and all this had to deal with the fact that the efficacy rates during COVID are pretty low because they've been low in general. Also, treating primary school and secondary school the same way in a disease that affects different age groups differently is idiotic. And yet, in America, in almost all states, we have insisted on this. You need to think about these kinds of problems. And to think about these problems, you have to get out of just confirming your prior position. Right? This is not about, you know, I as a teacher and my interest there and my interest in understanding education and how it works may even be at odds, and I have to deal with both those needs. Most people can't. It's a lot to ask, and it's something we don't naturally do. We naturally seek things that confirm our opinion. Look at any um, YouTube comments when the YouTube comments confirm what people already think. They gets a ton of praise. They love it. And then people who disbelieve it just disbelieve the other way. In fact, we talk about the wisdom of crowds except on highly polarized opinions. There's actually studies on this. The wisdom of crowds is better than the wisdom of even very intelligent individuals in areas where there is not a strong political or social opinion, meaning that the passions of crowds will override the wisdom of crowds, even though crowds are because of their collective knowledge, actually smarter than even more intelligent individuals than the average member of a crowd. When those crowds are highly politicized for their opinions, however, things get weird. And in an environment where political ideological identification replaces community identity, you can see where this is going to be highly deleterious. Now, I need to walk my dog, and I'm going to shut up. Have a good day.